Okay, so hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something that I think pretty much everyone listening has probably encountered at some point in their lives. We're going to try to make sense of toxic relationships. And I'm really hoping this deep dive will be super useful for anyone who's ever felt like something just wasn't quite right in one of their relationships. That feeling of being a little off.
Yeah, and to really get to the heart of this, we've been looking closely at this fascinating conversation from the Speak English with Class channel. They got this great podcast called English Leap Podcast, and they recently did an episode about overcoming toxic relationships, and it was hosted by Evan, Aaron, and Lucy, and they shared some really valuable insights. So what we're going to try to do is unpack those key points in a way that's clear and easy to grasp for everyone listening.
Exactly. Like, think of this as your personal toolkit for recognizing and navigating those relationships that just don't feel good.
Yeah.
One of the things that really stood out to me in that original podcast was this powerful analogy they used about a hidden garden and a choking vine. It's like you plant this tiny seed, right, full of potential and hope for this beautiful garden, and you're nurturing it and tending to it. And then all of a sudden, this vine appears out of nowhere and starts wrapping itself around your little seedling, slowly but surely blocking the sunlight and stealing all the nutrients.
What's so striking about that image, right, is how perfectly it captures the way toxic relationships often sneak up on us. Like, it's not always the big dramatic blow up, right? It's more like these small, subtle behaviors, a snide comment here, a dismissive gesture there, just this general feeling of unease. It's hard to pinpoint. And those things, they slowly build up over time until you're left feeling completely drained and depleted, just like that poor seedling being choked out by the vine.
It really makes you stop and think, right? And speaking of things to think about, they brought up this saying that I think we should spend some time unpacking. It's the idea that it is better to be alone than in bad company. And on the surface, it seems pretty straightforward, right? Like, of course, avoid mean people, duh. But when you dig a little deeper, like they did in the podcast, it becomes clear that it's about so much more than just avoiding negativity.
Yeah, if you apply that to your own personal experience, it really highlights the importance of your own inner peace and the journey of self-discovery. Choosing to step away from relationships that are consistently hurting you isn't about giving up. It's about recognizing your own worth and creating space for yourself to heal and grow. It's like giving yourself permission to step out of that darkness and into the light where you can finally breathe and just be yourself without that constant drain.
And I think it's easy to fall into these common traps, right? When we think about toxic relationship, like one of the big misconceptions that they talked about in the original podcast is this idea that toxic relationships are always these huge, dramatic explosions, constant screaming matches or betrayal on a grand scale.
That's a really good point, and it brings up this important question about how we define toxicity, because what the podcast hosts highlighted is that a lot of toxic relationships are much more insidious. It's not always this big dramatic scene that plays out. Sometimes it's those small, consistent digs that chip away at your self-esteem over time, or maybe it's that underlying anxiety you feel around someone without any obvious reason, is like death by a thousand cuts, right? Those small things, they add up and can be incredibly damaging. Have you ever felt like you're walking on eggshells around someone? That's a pretty clear sign.
Yeah, definitely. And another thing they address, which I think so many people struggle with, is this belief that leaving a toxic relationship should be easy. Like, if it's so bad, why don't you just walk away, right? But as they pointed out,
Yeah.
it's rarely that simple.
It's fascinating to think about all the complex emotional layers that can keep someone in a harmful situation, even when they know it's not good for them. You might genuinely care for the person. You might have shared history, good memories, and then there's that hope that things will change, even though maybe deep down, they won't acknowledging those very human feelings. The attachment, the hope, even within a dynamic that's hurting you, it takes a lot of courage. And it's often the first and honestly maybe the hardest step towards making healthier choices.
So it's clear that dealing with these relationships, as Evan, Aaron, and Lucy emphasized, isn't just about making a grand exit. It's a process. It starts with becoming aware of your own feelings and recognizing those red flags they talked about, like a consistent lack of safety. And I think it's important to clarify that safety goes beyond just physical safety, right? It's about emotional safety, too, feeling like you can be yourself without fear of judgment or attack. And then there's that lack of respect and this constant feeling of being undervalued, like your needs and opinions don't really matter.
Exactly. And if those core elements are consistently missing, the podcast suggests that something needs to change. Maybe it's setting boundaries, which can be really tough but so important. Maybe it's reaching out for support from friends, family, or even a therapist. And as they discussed, it could even mean making the difficult decision to end the relationship. The bottom line is trust your gut. Yeah. Listen to your intuition. You deserve to be treated with respect.
You know, one thing that really caught my attention was how they talked about how our understanding of relationships has shifted over time and across cultures. Like, it used to be that societal pressure to stay together no matter what was so strong.
It's interesting to think about how deeply ingrained some of those beliefs about relationships can be and how they vary around the world. But what the podcast host pointed out is that there's a growing global movement towards recognizing that love shouldn't equal pain and that respect is a fundamental human right in any relationship. And this shift is so important because it validates what you're feeling. If you're in a relationship that's causing you more harm than good, it frees you from those outdated expectations that you have to just grin and bear it.
And let's be real, admitting to yourself that a relationship is harmful can be incredibly difficult. It's easy to fall into that trap of blaming yourself, feeling like you've somehow failed.
And that's where reframing that feeling of failure becomes so crucial. Because recognizing a relationship is toxic isn't about dwelling on what went wrong or what you could have done differently. It's about acknowledging your own self-worth and understanding that you deserve to be treated with kindness, honesty, and genuine respect. And the podcast hosts emphasized that when you do create that space for yourself by stepping away from a toxic dynamic, it allows your own positive qualities to resurface, things like your courage, your compassion, your creativity. They get to come out and flourish.
They use this beautiful analogy of leaving a toxic situation being like stepping into sunlight after a long shadow, and I just love that imagery. It's so helpful.
It really captures that feeling of liberation and renewal right when you're no longer under that constant pressure and negativity. It speaks to the idea that even though leaving can be incredibly difficult and painful in the short term, the long-term benefits for your well-being could be transformative. Have you ever felt that sense of relief after a tough situation ends that's like that but magnified?
And they also touched on this societal pressure to stay loyal no matter what. This idea that if you're a good person, you just stick it out even when things are bad.
It raises an important question about what true loyalty really means, right? Because what they emphasized in the podcast is that loyalty shouldn't be one-sided. It's about reciprocity. It's about mutual respect. If you're constantly giving and the other person is constantly taking without any consideration for your needs or feelings, that's not a healthy dynamic. And choosing to break away from those harmful norms isn't selfish at all. It's an act of self-respect, and it sets a powerful example for others. It's like saying my well-being matters.
And they shared this incredibly powerful example of this in action, talking about Maya Angelou's conscious decision to remove herself from relationships where she was constantly being put down.
Bringing in an example like that from such a respected figure really drives home the point that this is a universal experience. Even people we admire have faced these challenges and made the choice to prioritize their own well-being. It reminds us that it's not only possible to walk away from toxic situations, but that doing so can lead to a much more fulfilling and authentic life.
You know, I thought they did a fantastic job of breaking down all the different forms that toxic relationships can take, because it's not just about romantic partners, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. They made it clear that toxicity can show up in all sorts of relationships with partners, friends, family members, even in the workplace. Think about those work environments that are constantly undermining your confidence and making you doubt yourself. The common thread is that no matter what the relationship is, you deserve to feel safe, respected, and seen for who you truly are.
And the key takeaway here is that whether it's a romantic relationship, a friendship, or a family dynamic, the principles for handling toxic situations are often the same. It's about finding your voice and speaking up for yourself when you can. It's about reaching out for support and guidance when you need it, and ultimately it's about being willing to make the tough decision to walk away if that's what's necessary to protect your emotional and mental health.
And if we bring it back to that powerful saying, it is better to be alone than in bad company, the podcast host really emphasized that it's not just about avoiding negativity, it goes so much deeper. It's about valuing your own peace and recognizing your inherent worth by choosing not to stay in relationships that hurt you. You're sending a powerful message to yourself that you matter, that your feelings are valid, and that you deserve to be happy.
So as you're listening to this, maybe take a moment to reflect on your own experiences or even the experiences of people you know. Think about that heavy vine analogy. What does real respect look and feel like to you in a relationship? What does it mean to feel safe, not just physically, but emotionally? What about feeling truly comfortable being yourself without fear of judgment?
And to build on that, the podcast hosts encourage listeners to share their thoughts and experiences if they feel safe and comfortable doing so. Talk to a trusted friend, a family member, or even within a supportive community sometimes. Simply expressing those feelings can be incredibly validating and might even help someone else who's going through something similar.
And they brought it all back to this fundamental understanding that handling a toxic relationship isn't about placing blame or judging anyone. It's about recognizing that everyone deserves to be in relationships that are built on kindness and mutual respect. And by choosing to free yourself from toxicity, you're essentially saying, my well-being matters, and I'm not going to settle for anything less.
Let's revisit that garden analogy one last time. Just imagine clearing away that choking vine, that toxic relationship, and creating space for your own beautiful garden to bloom. Imagine your own personal growth flourishing in the sunlight. Trust your instincts. Remember, you have the right to find peace, and you absolutely deserve to thrive.
I love that imagery. And as we wrap up this deep dive into toxic relationships, let's leave you with a final thought inspired by the wisdom shared in the original podcast, even when those doubts creep in. Remember that you're not alone. So many people have walked this path before you and emerged stronger, wiser, and more connected to who they truly are.
Take a moment to acknowledge your own strength just for being here, engaging with these ideas. Every step you take, whether it's setting a small boundary seeking support or making the courageous decision to walk away from a harmful situation, is a step towards greater self-respect and healing.
And as they so beautifully put it in the podcast, over time, the garden of your heart will bloom with bright blossoms of hope and renewal.
The original podcast transcript also included this really helpful section on important vocabulary and expressions, things like harmful boundaries, toxic influence, respect, self-worth, and that crucial concept of free yourself. Understanding these terms is so important for recognizing and addressing these situations in your own life.
So as you move forward, keep reflecting on your relationships, prioritize your well-being, and remember the insights we've explored in this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.